this is Paul, and today I'm going to show you how to create this Valentine's Day themed particle scene. It's got a lot of fun romantic elements, like all these hearts floating around, a nice glowy lens flare, and even the words "love you" spelled in an adorably incorrect fashion. So it's going to be a very in-depth tutorial on how to use our particle effects. So you can see all the tracks we're going to use. It's going to be created from scratch, so no media is necessary to create this, and a project file will be attached to the tutorial. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to create a new AE comp. And the first thing I'm going to do is just a very short 25 frame comp, and this is going to be my text. So you remember all those letters falling down. The way I did that, it's kind of a fun little trick. So when you create a single character in AE, you can animate the character offset. So to do that, go to the first frame of your timeline, just create a keyframe, then go to the end and create another one at 25. This will cycle through each of the letters in the alphabet once per frame, which is exactly what I want for this effect. So having done that, now I can create another new comp. This one's going to be longer than 25 frames. This is going to be about 10 seconds. And then I'll rename this one letters and drag it in. Okay, next I need to create a heart shape. And this is going to be a very important part of the scene. This is going to become the floor. It's also going to become the particle emitter. And in many cases, it's just going to be the shape that you see for the particles. So very important to have a good looking heart here to start. I'm going to use the polygon tool. Nice little trick is to just start with the polygon tool, come up here and select the convert vertex. I'm just going to make most of these rounded. And with that done, I'm going to go back to the pen tool, create another point directly below this top point here. Hold shift as I drag it up to keep it in line. And then I'm going to convert it back to a sharp corner. And now you can see what I'm going for here. So I'm just going to select these, push them up. Actually, maybe push these all down a bit. I notice I'm creating it upside down. It's just kind of easier to start with it like this. And then grab these handles. Again, holding shift gives you nice locked transforms. And there we go. We have a nice looking heart right there. And now I'll correct the angle. Just rotate it 180 degrees. Hey, perfect heart, not bad. It's actually the best one I've done yet. I'm very pleased. Okay, so now that we have our heart, I'm going to pre-compose this as well. And I'll just call it heart shape. Okay, now let's start creating the particles. So I'm going to start with a new solid. Color doesn't matter, but I'll change it just so it looks different. And we're going to apply BCC Particle Emitter. Now this is a very versatile tool. You can use it for a lot of cool effects. The default setting is just like dots flying at your face like that. So that's cool, but we're going to customize this a lot. Before we do that, let's finish setting up our scene by adding a camera. I'm going to make it a one node camera. Just makes it look a little easier to control. And I'm going to go ahead and position the camera now. So I'm going to go into two views. I'm going to turn the heart shape into a 3D layer. I'm going to rotate it -90 degrees. Hey, see that? We can see it. And I'm going to move the camera right above everything. So I'm going to change this to left view, raise it up, and rotate the angle of the camera also -90. We can see what the camera sees here. So I'm just going to back it up until it fits into frame. And so this kind of repositioning is just easier to do with a one node camera. You can use a two node camera, but I think this is faster. All right, now that we have that, looking good, I'll keep it in two views for just a little while longer. And these particles we have here, I'll rename this track particles. So we're going to use the comp camera, and now we're going to customize the emitter. So by default, it just uses a point. We want it to use a layer map, and we're going to use the heart shape that we just created. So if I set the speed to 0 and increase the birth rate, and maybe rotate it a little bit, you can see, hey, how nice, it's actually taking the shape of the heart. Isn't that sweet? All right, we're going to keep going though. So we want this to start above the camera. So further up, like so. And you can see the particles are just kind of doing nothing, it would seem. We're going to rotate the particles as well, so they also line up like so. So -90, just like everything else. And if it's a little off sync, that's okay. You can always reposition it manually if you have to, like here. And then we're going to increase the gravity. So 100 is realistic gravity, and you can see it now falling past our 3D layer. Now let's say we want the particles to hit this layer. We can do that. We just have to go to physics mode, change it to interaction with layers, twirl that down, and set the layer type to AE layer with alpha. And choose the layer, heart shape again, and choose the interaction. And we're going to make it bounce. So now you can see the particles bouncing off the plane, and it's really that easy. That's all you have to do to make it do that. If you want to see a little bit more variety here, you can increase the friction on A and the friction random. So this will make some of the particles bounce higher than others. It's definitely a good idea. And also, let's increase the lifespan of the particles so we see them a little bit longer. Let's increase it to 11 seconds. That way they'll always be on camera. And it's starting to look a little bit muddled here, having white particles on a white heart. So let's change the color of the particles so we can see what we're doing. And I'll just make it some kind of red for now. That looks good. So we have a heart within a heart forming. That could be your effect right there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start using some custom shapes in the particles to see how many we need and how fast they have to fall. So we're going to change the particle shape from image collection to host image layers, and nothing's selected, so you just get these rectangles. So if you come down to image layer, select letters. Okay, now see how small they are? You can't even make them out. They're like Tetris shapes here. So we're going to increase the size until we can see them, and you'll notice that they're changing every frame, just like our pre-composition does. So to make it stop doing that, we're going to go to sample mode, and instead of current frame, we're going to select birth frame. The nice thing about this is that it automatically loops itself over and over, so we're going to get a refresh of particles beyond our pre-composition there. Okay, so now that we see what the particles are going to look like, that's about the right size. We know how many we need and how many we don't need. So let's animate the emitter again to make it stop emitting once we have enough. So just going to create a keyframe for birth rate right here. And I want this to happen pretty quickly, so I'm going to ramp it up to like 2,000 particles. And then once it hits that, I'm going to set it to 0. So that should be enough to fill our space, and it is. Looks good. Keep in mind the actual framing of your video here. If I turn down the opacity there, I can see how big the heart will be, and that's pretty good. I can always come back into the heart shape and increase the size here if I want, or I can increase the particle emitter, but I'm going to leave it at this for now. I think it'll work well with our scene. Okay, back into the particles. Everything looks a little bit too uniform here. So we're going to change the apply mode, or the blend mode on the particles, to screen. And that gives us some nice diversity in the color mixing. And I'm going to back it off a little bit. Just change the blend mix to 50. Okay, now let's create the background. So I'm just going to do a new solid. We're going to apply a gradient to it. Nothing too special, just an AE color ramp. I'm going to change it to radial. And if I remember some basic color theory, yellow should go pretty well with pink. So I'm just going to make the center kind of a pale yellow and the outside a light pink. and put it to the background of our track. And notice I'm not making this a 3D layer, because that way I don't have to worry about my camera transforms or anything like that. Okay, looking pretty good so far. Now let's go back into two views, and you notice how the particles all kind of appear like that? Yeah, we don't want that to happen. So we're going to push the emitter higher up so that it's above the camera when they start falling. So to do that, just select the emitter again, and you can see where the point is here. Just push it up just beyond the camera should be enough, and that gives you some nice depth as the letters fall. And this is again why I chose a 24mm camera. That gives us some depth, maybe a little too much depth. I can always come back in, change the zoom here to sort of compensate. Maybe put this to 1200. So you don't want to flatten it too much, but you also don't want it to take 1,000 years for the particles to hit the floor. So that looks good. As long as it's done by about 4 or 5 seconds, that should be good enough. Nice. And another thing we're going to do, I'll save it for last, but I'll tell you about it now, is adding a motion blur to these particles. That's in the render group. I'm going to use the smooth fast. That really helps sell the perspective. And if I just do a quick half quality preview here, you can see how much realism it adds to add a motion blur. Alright, so turning off motion blur so we can work a little bit more quickly. Actually, I like half mode. I'll stay in half mode. Alright, so now I'm pretty happy with how those look. Let's add some of the other elements you saw in the scene. First, we're going to add the background row of hearts. I'll just call this background hearts. And to do that, we're going to use the particle array effect. And it's very similar to particle emitter, except it's not an emitter, it's just particles. So you can have a lot of fun with this too. Again, use comp camera. We're going to increase the particles in the Z dimension, turn down the particles in the Y dimension, turn down the scale on the Y dimension. And after all that, we're going to go to this dispersion group and increase the dispersion master a lot and increase the scale X. There, so it fills the frame. Now they're not doing a lot right now. I'll solo these two tracks so you can see what's happening. So we're going to add some motion. I'm going to go into fractal noise, increase the amplitude just a little bit, and we're going to have individual particle noise too. So this gives them all something to do. Going to turn down the auto evolve speed to like 25. Get a quick preview. Perfect. Now, circles aren't very romantic, so we're going to change the particle to another heart. So we're going to go into particles. Instead of 3D spheres, we're going to use image layers. We're going to use the heart shape again. And you can see it's all kind of dark. It's not very romantic either. So instead of using color in alpha, we're just going to use alpha. That way we can set our own color here, as long as we turn off mix in particle color and built-in lights. Alright, these are all things that just make it a little simpler, in case you're wondering why I'm doing them. Alright, so now we have a lot of little bouncing hearts. They're all very happy. I think there's too many of them. So we're going to turn down the particle count to about 6 and 3 and 3. Okay, that's better. And they're all very uniform, aren't they? They're just kind of facing us. You know, it might make you a little uncomfortable. So what we're going to do is transform the particles. We're going to rotate them all around. Now you notice we only have one control for rotation, and just rotate master, and we can increase the variance there, but they're still very flat looking. So check this out. Even though we selected image layers here, once we've selected a layer, if we change this to some other shape, like say 3D spheres again, it'll keep the image layer. So now we have a 3D shape with the image mapped onto it. So that lets us rotate in 3 dimensions now, and you can get a bunch of really cool effects with that. Okay, but I don't want to use spheres, I want to use 3D planes. So I can take advantage of these other rotation dimensions, and I'm going to push them up a lot so they all look very different. Okay, so now we have a good variety of particle angles, And a couple other things we can do. If I go into control maps, and I'm going to apply this control map to all particle rotations. So control maps are kind of like controls for your controls. So the important thing here is that you can select any of these, random is good, and what I'm going to do is just animate the apply offset so you can see what this is doing. It's giving each particle independent rotation setting. So it works best if we animate this. Depending on how fast you want them to go, you may want to increase this range quite a bit, or maybe just, you know, a few pixels. And there it is. And if we look at the particles on top of that, we can see a nice scene forming up. Okay, so we have our background particles and our hearts. Oh, those should go in the background as well. There we go. And since I did the cool rotation changes on those particles, why don't we do them on these too? So again, same idea. We're going to change the particle shape to 3D cards. And we're going to go into the transform particle group and do the same kind of thing. We are just going to use much smaller rotations here because these will never stop rotating. So that's something to keep in mind, that the particle emitter is always going to create new particles and it's always going to animate them. The particle array is more static. So those are two ways to think about them as different. So now when the particles land, they'll still have a little bit of life to them. That looks good. Okay, so let's get out of particles for a second and add the lens flare. So I'm going to create a new black solid. It's going to be black because when I apply the lens flare to it, I need to change the apply mode so I can see through it. And you could just apply lens flare to any of your other tracks, by the way, and avoid having to do that, but I like to keep it as a separate layer so I can work with the effect more independently. Anyway, so we have our lens flare here. Let's make it look a little more interesting by selecting a preset from the preset browser. So we can see all the presets at once. This is a really good one. I'm going to apply it. And there we go. All right, now we want it to use the comp camera, just like everything else. And to make the filter a little easier to control, let's create an AE light and use that as the light source. So go into light source and select comp. Okay, now we can change where the light is with the AE light. It's just a little easier. Another cool thing we can do with Lens Flare 3D is something called Flare Trigger. And if you turn that on, like a real lens flare, it gets brighter when it hits the edge of your screen. I'm going to put it right in the corner. So when we animate the camera to move in on the scene, the lens flare will naturally change intensity. It'll look good, trust me. All right, a couple other cool things to add in the lens flare. We're going to turn on the elliptical caustic. You can see how that looks right here. It's a nice faint little thing. It looks so good, I'm actually going to increase the intensity on it so we can see it a little better. Next, I want to add some orbs. This will give us some more texture in the scene. So if I scroll this down, I'm going to turn up the illumination radius and go into the orbs group, and I'll just turn up the intensity of the orbs just a bit, just so you can kind of see them like there. And there it is. Okay, that's the lens flare. Next, let's add another layer of hearts. So we're going to cheat and just duplicate this other one we already created and just move it above in our timeline. So instead of background hearts, I'll call this big hearts. And let's just see what that layer looks like. Well, it looks the same. So we're going to change it. We're going to make the size much bigger. And now because they're so big, we don't need quite so many. So I'm going to change these numbers down to like 2 each. And maybe change the scale so they're a little closer together. All right, that's good. And let's also slow down the fractal noise because they're so big. You don't want them moving too fast. It'll look weird. Same thing with the animated offset we had here. So we started at -500. So this time we're going to end at just -450. And that way the hearts are a lot slower. Big things move slower. It's just one of those rules of the universe, I guess. And now that we see how big they are, let's make them a little bit transparent so they don't block the whole scene we just created. So in Particle, is going to turn down the opacity a bit. And that looks good. All right, so unsolo these tracks so we can see everything through it. Nice. Okay, now another thing that will look really good is if we blur the heart background and the big hearts. I'm just going to use fast blur to do that. And you don't have to go crazy, just enough to sort of diffuse the edges. You can actually use the camera's depth of field to create this similar sort of look, but anyone who's used depth of field will know that is much more processor intensive, and you can get a very nice effect this way as well. Okay, we're almost done. Last thing we're going to do is create the letters that show up on the heart. So this is going to be our type on text, which is also the name of the filter I used to create this effect, type on text. It is also a 3D effect, so it's going to use the camera. First, I got to type the message and make sure you match the font that you used before. I used Calibri, and it was bold, and it was center justified, and it was also very small. So 24 should be good. There it is. Now this is extruded text by default, so we're going to have to change that, as you can see. So I don't want it to extrude at all. I'm going to change the extrusion to 0, and we don't want to bevel either, so set that to 0 too. So now we have to see the text. Let's go into 2 views. So we want to make sure that our text is on the same plane as the heart. So in transforms, I can just push it down until, like it's right here, until it matches up. And of course I have to rotate this text also, and there it is. So I can move it a bit. I can also move it here, but let's just center it manually a little bit more, like so. For the material, we're going to increase the ambient intensity all the way up, and we're going to animate the color. I'll animate it later. For now, we'll just make sure it's also like a nice light pink color, or kind of that deep red. Ambient color, same thing. I want it to look as flat as possible so it matches the other letters. I'm even going to turn down the specular strength. Okay, now what makes type on text is the do reveal effect right here. And this is fully automated. You just have to set the start points in these controls. So let's say I want it to start with a fade. I just set the fade to 0. And then you can see the letters automatically fade on. That's a lot going on there, so we'll just solo these 2 again. There. So love you. How sweet. All right, now let's overlap the letters a little bit more so they sort of come on a bit closer together. Let's have them decelerate as their animation, and let's have them rotate a bit too. Get back here so we can see how it's going to look. So rotate every dimension just a bit. Reveal order, let's do random. Increase the random seed just so it doesn't go in a predictably random way. It's cute. And let's make the reveal time a lot faster. Let's say 22. And overlap, again, the more you increase this, the more they come on together. The smaller that is, the more they come on one at a time. So that's up to you. I'm going to keep it pretty much all together. Now we just move this whole track down to where we want them to really appear. So if I make the particles visible again, we can see that they've just about finished collecting around 3.5 seconds. Maybe a good time to have these come up. So it's sort of like they're coming up out of the madness there. And that's also when we're going to animate the color so they stand out. So animate the diffuse color. That's the one that is the most prevalent. Just have it come white. And if it still looks a little dim, keep in mind there are built-in lights with this filter. So if I just increase the built-in light intensity, that should take care of that. And there, so now the letters kind of pop up just to tell you they love you, and that's very nice of them. And that, I believe, is the last element that we have to create here. The only last thing to do is to animate the position of the camera, which is one of the easiest things in the world. Just go to camera, reveal the position, create a keyframe here and at the end. And you can take some liberties with this. I chose to be very simple, just have it, do a nice standard pull back. You could put rotation into it. It would look good since these are all 3D elements. And the very, very last thing is to put the motion blur back onto the falling letters to make it look all awesome. And we'll put it back at full res too, so we can see how it really looks. All right, and there we go. So learned a lot about the particle emitter, the particle array, and even lens flare and type on text. So if you liked what you saw here, check out more tutorials online and at our website at boriseffects.com.